And we're back. Disenchantment has returned for part 4 on Netflix with 10 more episodes, and I'm here to break down how they made me feel and what I think we'll see moving forward. I probably would have had this video out sooner, but then the news about the damn Futurama revival broke, and that kinda had to take precedent, but now I'm here and I'm ready to go. This will be a spoiler review, so if you haven't seen the latest episodes, definitely go check those out and then come back. Alright, you're still here? Let's dive into it. So last year, Disenchantment Part 3 invested me in the series like the first 2 parts did not. The show embraced serialization instead of falling back into episodic stretches. It set up engaging mysteries that I was ecstatic to dive into, and it showed us sides of the Disenchantment universe that we simply hadn't seen yet. And while Part 4 does continue a lot of the things I loved about Part 3, I'm sad to say that it also falls back into some of its previous tendencies that I did not love as much. I felt very thrown off in the first few episodes of the season because after Part 3 so seamlessly wove its story into the serialized format, the first 3 episodes of Part 4 all felt very separate from one another. Granted, I see what they were doing. Each episode, Love is Hell, The Good, the Bad, and the Bum Bum, and The Cabinet of Dr. Chaz, all followed up a separate cliffhanger from the end of Part 3. Love is Hell focuses on the Bean and Lucy cliffhangers, as Bean was about to be married off to a mysterious figure in hell, and Lucy had died and was actually sent to heaven for his sacrifice. The Good, the Bad, and the Bum Bum focuses on Elfo being kidnapped by the ogres and finally following up on the storyline about his mother. And The Cabinet of Dr. Chaz is all about Zog's return from insanity at the insane asylum. And while I don't dislike any of these things individually, I cannot pretend it didn't feel disjointed to jump from one to the next to the next. I guess the through line is Bean's return to Dreamland, but those scenes are so few and far between that I almost forgot about them. I wish they had found a way to weave all of these stories together to make the first 3 of the season feel a little more interconnected and serialized. Because like I said, I really liked the stories in these 3 episodes, but I was just thrown off by the way they were all so separate. But let's talk about them and their implications. So the big reveal was that Dagmar was trying to marry off Bean to Satan himself, which seems to tie into the contract that Maru made with Hell that's been drawn out for over 40 episodes. But at the last moment, Bean uses Dagmar's blood for the marriage contract instead of her own. First of all, the animation for the sequence was so cool. I really love how the blood handprints clasp each other. That's rad. But second, this whole development I think is really interesting, because while Dagmar has generally seemed to be on top of everything that is happening, this feels to me like something she did not expect to happen. She yells no when her blood is stamped on the contract, her facial expressions here look like genuine confusion, and even the way she speaks to Bean afterwards initially feels like genuine concern. Who knows, maybe I'm wrong here, this might all be a ruse, but I think this is an instance of Dagmar simply falling into success, since now she is seemingly the Queen of Hell. But of course we don't really get much more out of this development for the rest of the season, save for a bit on the back end, which I think is largely representative of another issue I have with the show. They tend to always set up these big cliffhangers, especially at the end of a season, and then breeze right past their resolution. We see this in the next 2 episodes as well. I was really happy that we finally got the full reveal of who Elfo's mother is, and that he's half ogre, and that backstory was all great. But then Elfo is literally just whisked away at the end of the episode by wild happenstance. They basically ignore the whole ogre story for the remainder of the season. Zog's time in the insane asylum felt similar. The whole Zog insanity arc in Part 3 felt like such a huge deal, and then they basically solve it in a single episode. Granted, I do like the way they address the storyline somewhat, forcing Zog to confront that very fear that sent him down his mental health spiral in the first place, being buried alive. The way he faced this and came out of it unscathed mostly worked for me. And while I do think that many of these resolutions, largely Dagmar and Elfo being half ogre, will have larger implications in the grand scheme of the series, it's frustrating to feel like the show just breezes right past them. This happens more later in the season too, so we'll talk about it when we get there. Oh, and we didn't even mention Jerry, who comes back in a hugely satisfying way this season. He basically returns to life and becomes just super lovable. I'm really glad that he's becoming a larger part of the cast because he's a sweet and genuine boy.
Joey's back!
So next, let's talk about Cloyd, Becky, and Freckles. I'm gonna do an entire separate video about Freckles as well, but this whole storyline has a lot of questions to be answered. Cloyd and Becky start to rule Dreamland in everyone's absence and are experimenting turning Dreamland citizens into goons. The crew manages to drive the duo out of the castle, but they stick around when Freckles re-enters the picture. Basically, as I predicted after Part 3, thanks to this ancient language graffiti that read Freckles was here, it turns out Freckles was alive all along. Cerserio and Oddval believe they are responsible for bringing him to life, but we see him move on his own before the experiment. He was definitely sentient prior to this, and Freckles seems to have an existing relationship with Cloyd and Becky, who also both inhabit the bodies of other ventriloquist dummies. The big question I have here surrounding the story is, Who the hell is inhabiting Freckles if that's how this works? And that's going to be the big question that my Freckles video focuses on, so stay tuned for that. But I think that Freckles' motivations so far do seem to line up with Cloyd, Becky, and Dagmar in a lot of ways. He spends his entire first appearance this season trying to splinter Bean and Zog's relationship.
Bean's so predictable. 1, she's gonna come over here. 2, she's gonna say, "Shut up, Freckles." 3, she's gonna say, "You're crazy."
While also exploring the depths of Zog's dreams and going after his childhood insecurities in competition with his brother Yog, as well as his position as king. And because Freckles seemed to be sold to Zog by Dagmar, or somebody who looks an awful lot like Dagmar back in part 3, I think it's likely that Freckles is attempting to weaken the leadership in Dreamland to make room for Dagmar. This lines up with his plan towards the end of the season 2, as Freckles basically orchestrates a situation where Derek and Jasper think they've killed an elf, and then are encouraged to flee Dreamland. By leaving a note behind for Zog, it ensures that he will go after his children, leaving Bean alone to lead the kingdom. After this initial little Freckles arc, we get an underwater episode where Bean, Elfo, Lucy, and Zog meet the Sea Trogs, who live in a fractured section of Dreamland Castle that rests under the sea. While the episode itself was just okay for me, I really liked getting this little bit of history about Dreamland Castle, and also seeing what parts of the castle looked like when they were still inhabited by the elves. And the entire existence of Sea Trogs begs some more questions based on a later reveal this season, but we'll get there. Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about Mora's return. Now, we all knew it was coming when Bean passed out underwater, but I have to admit I was still very unsettled by how long they sat on her lifeless body floating there. It was an uncomfortably long wait for Mora to smash through that window. But this was definitely a gratifying moment, and though it was but a tease, I think it works super effectively. The writers really called how much people would attach to Bean and Mora last season, and now they're slow building it in a way that I expect to pay off big in part 5.
I gotta go.
I also loved the heart-to-heart that Zog and Bean had about her romance with Mora, and the way they connected over their lost loves. These are the kinds of character moments where this season really excelled for me. This led Zog to seek out Ursula again, so hey, let's talk about Jasper. Another prediction confirmed. I really like how we saw Zog learning to be a better father for Jasper. It was sweet, and I've always loved his relationship with Ursula as well. Though let's be honest, literally none of us thought that Ursula was dead after this one. This show does kind of have a death problem. They've killed Elfo, Zog, Lucy, Bean, and Ursula now. None of them are actually dead. But I did love the development this led to, with Jasper living at the castle and forming a rivalry turned bond with his half-brother Derek. This was all really, really good stuff for me. These final 4 episodes are really where the season kicks into high gear, which I guess is a pretty common pattern with the show now. In the 7th episode, we get this very ominous flashback that showcases a battle in this castle cove between humans and a team-up of elves and mermaids. This is super interesting and I think probably deserves more delving into. In the sequence, we see the elves and mermaids are actually winning the battle until an unseen force appears and vaporizes them all with the same lightning power that Bean possesses. A dagger is then thrust into the mermaid's chest, killing her. On top of this, for some reason, Bean is shown this flashback when she grabs the hilt of the dagger herself, almost like the hilt of the dagger was triggering this memory. So there is obviously some major connection between the unseen elf/mermaid slayer and Bean herself. A distant relative maybe? Something even more sinister? I'm gonna mull this one over as I rewatch the entire series, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts as well. So let's talk about all of the big revelations in the final 3 episodes of the season. One of the big ones is obviously that Trogs and elves are the same, which called it, though I didn't call that it was the goo that turned elves into Trogs. This also raises questions about sea Trogs. Are they Trogs who have evolved to live underwater, or are they actually some kind of other creature that has eaten the goo and turned into a Trog variant? Also, does that matter? The goo is a huge source of questions moving forward. We saw they used it to resurrect Lucy's body earlier in the season, giving him wings. Then Bean drinks some in the final stretch of episodes, which leads to this whole Dream Bean duplicate story, which I have to admit seemed to come out of nowhere. But I do think there are a few smaller things we can deduce about this. I think the goo has got to have some unique effect on Bean, Lucy, and Elfo, as they are the Trog saviors. The symbol on the goo bottles is literally the symbol of their triumvirate.
For only the one true savior can use the ultimate power of the goo to save us all.
Now, the timing is wonky, but we did see Lucy's body seemingly come back to life earlier in the season, while his soul was still navigating the afterlife. So 2 Lucys? And around the same time, we saw the Trogs pour the goo into Lucy's body. Is it possible that the goo specifically has something to do with these dream variants popping up, especially when you take into account Lucy's rambling about his dream counterpart, which I just have to point out is named Goosey. Goosey. C. They play this like a joke that overstays its welcome, but I mean, come on, a Lucy duplicate with the literal word goo in the name. This is Gooigi all over again. They nearly feed Elfo the goo earlier in the season as well, so I'm curious if something important will happen when all three saviors consume it. I actually also think this might explain Dagmar eating the Trog brains back in part 3. If Trogs are elves with goo running through them, is this Dagmar trying to consume the goo for herself? And honestly, I have no idea where this duplicate Bean storyline might go. Though it is interesting to point out that the dream duplicate Bean is the one who inhabits Bean's original body, the one that consumed the goo in the first place. And in the end, Bean beheads her old body, and Dagmar is left with Bean's original head. The post-credits tease shows Dagmar, Satan, and Bean's head on the three thrones of Dreamland. It would be pretty gross if we saw Dagmar eating her own daughter's brain, right? But what people are really going to talk about is that cliffhanger kiss between Bean and Mora, reunited for real, at last. It's interesting, part 4 actually seems to leave fewer blatant cliffhangers than part 3, though there are still a few. Dagmar is now in control of Dreamland, that's one. Zog needs to rescue Derek, Jasper, Ursula, Oddval, and probably Freckles from the Steamland Freak Show, and Bean is now with Mora, which I guess is less of a cliffhanger and more of just where she was when the season ended. So based off the general trajectory of the past cliffhangers, my guess is that these get wrapped up pretty quickly into part 5, but hopefully it also means we get another episode with Bean and Mora hanging out in the Mermaid Society. But I do think that this might be an interesting angle for the series moving forward. We see in that flashback that somebody who is somehow related to Bean's magic straight up murders this red-haired mermaid. A red-haired mermaid who was also seen on the stained glass in the ruins of the old Dreamland Castle underwater, and I don't think that's a coincidence, especially because Mora busts through that glass. But it also means the elves were immortalizing this red-haired mermaid, and likely before she died, since the events of that flashback, if I were to guess, are depicting the humans taking over Dreamland Castle for the first time. This might mean that this mermaid is an important figurehead in mermaid and elven history, and if they discover that Bean is somehow related to the person that murdered this figure, that could definitely cause drama for the Mora and Bean relationship. But I also think that if Bean and Mora are related to these two historical figures that were at the forefront of this Dreamland conflict, thematically it would make a ton of sense for them to get together, uniting their people and healing that rift. That seems to be a major theme in Disenchantment: unity. We saw the Trogs and Elves reunite this season, Elfo has this connection between the Elves and Ogres, Lucy has a connection between Heaven and Hell, and I'm still very confident in my Miri the Mop Girl theory, more than ever after part 4. If you haven't seen the video I did last year about that theory, please check it out, but the gist is that I think Miri is likely both related to an elf and the historical line of Oggs. I initially said I think it was a distant relation, but I'm now thinking that it might be more likely that she is just the daughter of an elf and King Yogg. This theoretically would have placed her ahead of Zog in the line of succession if they had known about her. This idea sprung from some very interesting imagery in part 3. For one, we briefly saw her ominously sitting on the throne in an episode, and later she has tossed the throne of Dreamland from Bean almost like a bouquet, and literally stood with it next to a line of busts of the previous kings, like she was next in line. Miri is also said to be 23 years old, but very short, and we curiously never actually see her ears. She hinted that she had some type of magic at the end of part 3 as well. Part 4 continued these little hints in a big way. For one, we got another shot of her sitting on the throne. They seem to be making a habit out of that. In another scene, Zog refers to her very curiously.
I'm Broom Girl now.
Ooh, pardon me, Your Majesty.
They're kind of laying it on thick, to be honest. But the best evidence comes from her increased presence in the season in general. She's almost becoming one of the gang. And on top of that, one of the primary things she was doing this season was lecturing Bean on how to be a better leader.
Are you kidding me? You're the queen of Dreamland. You control everything. Maybe you should look beyond yourself and stop acting like a spoiled, entitled brat.
They were literally showing that Miri has the type of leadership skills and know-how to run a kingdom in a way that Bean does not. At this point, I would be completely shocked if this theory didn't turn out to be true, and honestly, I'm pretty proud of myself for it. So overall, I liked part 4, but felt a little let down after how much I loved part 3. It felt like a bit of a step back structurally, and I do find myself growing a bit tired of how many mysteries the show continues to set up, and then how brazenly these mysteries are answered. I wish we would just live with the ramifications of these mysteries for a bit when they're solved. That being said, I can still see all the pieces, and I do have faith that everything is going to come together in a really interesting way. I think we should probably expect a renewal announcement soon. I know some artists have been working on Disenchantment as recently as January, which tells me they're probably working on new episodes. I would expect one more production season for a total of 60 episodes, and that the next 20 will likely be written to the series finale. So next you can expect me to do another Futurama references and Disenchantment video like I did the last couple years, and then I'm also going to do that video about Freckles that I mentioned. I'm not confident I have as strong of theories for Freckles that I did for Miri, but I really want to work through and speculate about that, so stay tuned. I'd also love to hear what you thought of Disenchantment Part 4 and what you're looking forward to most out of Part 5, so please let me know below in the comments. Peace!
Johnny to Cellos!